The town of Willow Creek woke slowly under the hush of a spring morning, wrapped in a blanket of dew and the scent of lavender drifting through the cobblestone streets. The bakery on Elm Street had just lit its ovens, the bookstore beside it hummed with the soft jazz of an old stereo, and across the sleepy square stood a flower shop called Bloom and Grace. Eleanor Hart had owned it for 3 years now. Every morning, she arrived before dawn, her chestnut hair tied in a loose braid and her hands ready to greet the world with bouquets of color. There was something about flowers that always felt like hope to her hope that something beautiful could bloom even after a harsh winter. She arranged stems with quiet care, as if each petal carried a story. Her days were wrapped in the rhythms of nature, yet a gentle emptiness lingered in the quiet hours between deliveries. Today, though, felt different. Miles Bennett had driven through Willow Creek before, but he'd never stopped, never really looked at it. An architect from the city, he was used to concrete edges and steel skylines. But after losing his father 3 months ago, the fast-paced hum of urban life started to feel unbearable. His mother had mentioned Willow Creek once, where she and his father visited in their early years, where laughter echoed between lemon trees and time slowed down just enough to matter. So here he was, parked beside a dusty map, wondering what he was doing in a place where people still said good morning. With a wave, the idea was to design a retreat, a wellness center tucked between hills, but secretly, Miles hoped he'd find something else too. Maybe a quiet space inside himself. Maybe a reason to feel again. He stepped out of his truck and was immediately hit by the scent of fresh roses. It pulled him toward the shop with the green awning, where the bell above the door chimed like a soft greeting. Eleanor didn't look up at first. She was focused on tying a ribbon around a spring bouquet, her brows furrowed, tongue peeking from the corner of her lips in concentration. "Excuse me," came a voice low, steady, with a trace of weariness beneath its polite tone. She glanced up, startled. He stood there tall, well-dressed, but with sleeves rolled up and a tired kindness in his eyes. He looked like someone trying to find something he'd lost and didn't know how to ask for it. "Sorry," she said, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "Didn't hear the bell." Miles offered a small smile. "It's okay. The smell got me first. What is that jasmine?" She tilted her head, pleased. "Yes, you've got a good nose for flowers." "I'm an architect," he replied, as if that explained everything. "I'm used to lines and angles, not petals and perfume." She set the bouquet down and wiped her hands. "Well, lines and flowers aren't all that different. Both need balance. Both speak to the heart if you let them." He paused, taking her in for a moment. She was unlike anyone he'd met in years. There was something quietly luminous about her. "I'm Miles," he said finally. "Eleanor." They shook hands. His was warm and slightly calloused, her soft and lightly dusted with rose thorns. "So," she asked, tucking her apron, "what brings you to my little kingdom of color, Miles the architect?" He chuckled. "A project, possibly, maybe a retreat space. Or maybe I just needed to see what peace looks like." Eleanor smiled, her heart quietly thudding in her chest. Something about him felt like a turning page. "Well, in that case," she said, reaching for a small daisy, "you'll need this." He raised a brow. "A flower?" "A reminder," she said, "that beauty isn't always loud." Miles stared at the tiny bloom in his hand, the kind of thing he'd never normally notice. But now, somehow, it felt important. And just like that, something unspoken passed between them, a thread of warmth, a flicker of possibility. Eleanor Hart's life unfolded in soft hues. After inheriting the flower shop from her grandmother, she left behind the rushed rhythm of city life where she'd once worked as a graphic designer. Her parents had passed when she was 16, both gone in a car accident that changed everything. It was her grandmother who taught her that grief could coexist with beauty, and that sometimes the heart finds healing in simple things like watering Lila or naming new roses. She found comfort in routine. Early mornings, deliveries, hands in soil. Her apartment above the shop was filled with dried lavender, secondhand books, and sunlight through lace curtains. At 32, she wasn't lonely exactly dash, just waiting. She didn't know for what. She told herself she was content, but every time she helped a nervous groom pick out wedding flowers or arrange peonies for a new baby's arrival, she felt a little ache like a missing line in a poem. Eleanor had friends, people who loved her. There was Annie, the pastry chef next door, who often left croissants at her door, and Mr. Winslow, the elderly man who stopped by each Tuesday for tulips for his late wife. She belonged to the town, and it belonged to her. But late at night, when the world was quiet, she would sometimes wonder what it would be like to love someone who truly saw her. Miles Bennett, on the other hand, came from a world of glass towers and tight schedules. At 35, he was successful by most standards, a lead architect for one of Chicago's top firms. But he had never stopped long enough to ask himself if that success felt like joy. His father's sudden passing had knocked the wind out of him. They had grown distant in later years, their conversations reduced to emails and missed calls. When Miles cleaned out his father's attic, he found old photographs, his parents laughing in fields, kissing under the Willow Creek gazebo. It stirred something in him, regret, curiosity, longing. The trip to Willow Creek was supposed to be a design sabbatical, a way to reconnect with his creative instincts. But what Miles didn't say aloud, what he barely admitted to himself, was that he needed to remember who he was without the blueprints and boardrooms. The man who used to sketch buildings in the margins of his high school notebooks, who used to believe that spaces could heal people. He rented a small cottage on the edge of town, ivy crawling up its stone walls, and a fireplace that hadn't been lit in years. It was rustic, a bit creaky, but it overlooked a quiet lake and had a porch that caught every sunset. He spent his mornings sketching and his afternoons walking the town. But more often than not, he found himself pausing near Bloom and Grace, the flower shop that somehow felt warmer than the sun-drenched cafe or the town library. There was something grounding about Eleanor. Her presence was unhurried, genuine. She remembered people's birthdays, noticed when someone had a bad day, and always tucked a hidden flower into large arrangements, just for luck. They didn't talk every day, but when they did, it lingered. One morning, he came by for lavender. The next, he asked about peonies. And once, he brought her coffee without saying a word, just left it on the counter while she was fussing with an arrangement. She turned, smiled, and for a second, he forgot what loneliness had ever felt like. Willow Creek itself was the kind of place that breathed slowly. Time didn't run there, it strolled. Children played barefoot in fields, the postman whistled. Old tunes and the annual spring fair was the highlight of every calendar. There were Friday open mics at the town square, pie contests judged by schoolchildren, and stories that lived in the hearts of every porch rocker. For Eleanor, the town was her home, its rhythms as familiar as her own heartbeat. For Miles, it was beginning to feel like something more than a temporary escape. They saw each other more often now, sometimes by design, sometimes by accident. A shared laugh at the farmer's market, a conversation about tulip symbolism that turned into a 2-hour discussion about loss, memory, and dreams not yet chased. And through it all, they were still themselves, separate people with their own shadows. Eleanor still hesitated at the God of change. She still wondered if letting someone in would unravel the quiet life she had finally built. And Miles still wrestled with guilt. For the years he had prioritized ambition over presence, for the way grief carved silence into his chest. But there was a gentle pull between them, Like two constellations quietly drifting closer, she began, keeping an extra coffee cup on the back shelf. He started drawing window gardens with roses in full bloom. Neither of them said it out loud yet, but something was shifting. Eleanor never meant to make space for him in her life. But somewhere between early morning deliveries and evening walks past the square, Miles had become part of her daily rhythm. It started with a request. "I want to learn about flowers," he said one afternoon, leaning against her shop counter. Sleeves rolled to his elbows, a hint of nervous energy under his calm exterior. She raised an eyebrow. "Flowers?" He shrugged, playful. "I figure if I'm designing a wellness center in a town named after willow trees, I should understand the language of nature. Plus, I like the company." She smirked, smooth. But she said yes. So every Thursday afternoon, Miles showed up at Bloom and Grace. He learned about soil acidity, petal shapes, and the difference between dahlias and ranunculus. He listened with focused attention, his pencil tapping lightly on his sketch pad as Eleanor spoke with the kind of passion that made even weeds sound poetic. Their lessons often bled into long talks. They'd sit on the back porch of the shop drinking mint tea while the sun dipped behind rooftops. Eleanor told him about her grandmother, how she used to hum lullabies while pruning roses, how she believed that every bouquet could heal a broken piece of someone. Miles listened more than he spoke, but when he did, it was always something that mattered. He shared stories of his childhood climbing trees with scraped knees, building forts out of couch cushions, sketching dream houses at age 8. He talked about his father in pieces, like puzzle fragments he was trying to put back together. And slowly, gently, Eleanor began to see the boy behind the architect. One evening, as they were rearranging the shop window display together, their hands brushed, while reaching for the same stem of sunflowers. They froze. Her fingers were cold from the water bucket, his warm from holding the lantern. Their eyes met, just for a breath, but in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Neither said a word. But that night, Eleanor added sunflowers to her living room, and Miles couldn't stop thinking about the softness of her touch. From then on, their moments were full of subtle sparks. At the spring fair, they wandered past booths of homemade candles and fresh pies. Miles, noticing Eleanor eyeing the strawberry tarts, bought 2 without a word and handed her one. She laughed, wiping powdered sugar from his cheek, and he caught himself watching her more than the fireworks. During one of their Thursday sessions, a sudden downpour trapped them inside the greenhouse behind the shop. Rain drummed against the glass in a steady rhythm, and the air filled with the heady scent of soaked soil and blooming jasmine. Eleanor stood barefoot, toes sticking into the cool floor tiles, her cardigan slipping from one shoulder. Miles, seated beside the Lilla, looked up at her with something tender in his eyes. "Ever feel like time stands still when it rains?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Or maybe it just slows down enough to let us feel everything we usually rush past." She didn't respond, but the quiet smile she gave him felt like a secret blooming. They laughed more now, at clumsy accidents like the time Miles knocked over a vase and tried to clean it up with a fern, or the time Eleanor accidentally died. His fingertips blew while teaching him to press flowers. There were deeper moments too. Like the night they sat on the edge of the lake near Miles' cottage. He had invited her after closing the shop, saying he needed a second opinion on the reflection deck design. But they never got to the plans. Instead, they watched the stars shimmer on the water's surface, shoulders brushing, silence comfortably stretched between them. "I haven't done this in years," Eleanor whispered. "What?" "Watch the stars with someone I could trust." Miles turned toward her, his voice barely above a murmur. "I'm glad I get to be that someone." She looked at him then, truly looked. And in his eyes, tired, searching, sincere, she saw something that made her chest tighten. The next day, She found herself humming while arranging roses, and Miles caught himself sketching flower beds into every architectural draft. Still, neither one had confessed what was quietly growing between them. They were caught in that sweet, aching in between where glances held more than words, and simple moments were charged with meaning. One morning, Miles arrived earlier than usual, carrying a sketchbook. "I've been working on something," he said. "Wanted your opinion." She opened the pages and gasped out there, among the designs for the retreat center, were tiny illustrations, flower vines climbing wooden beams, benches, carved like tulips, windows framed with pressed leaves. "You included bloom and grace." He shrugged shyly. "I thought maybe the retreat could use a garden that feels like home." Eleanor's voice caught in her throat. It wasn't just a design choice. It was something else, something deeper. Their hands touched as he passed the sketchbook back. "I've never had someone see me like this." She whispered. "I see you, Eleanor," he replied, his gaze steady. Every quiet part. That night, she stood at her window long after closing, holding one of the blue-tipped daisies he'd left behind, and she knew whatever this was, it wasn't fleeting. The first time Miles invited Eleanor over for dinner, he burnt the garlic bread. She laughed so hard she nearly dropped her wine glass, and instead of being embarrassed, he joined her in laughter, his eyes crinkling in that way she loved, like joy had finally learned where to live. They ended up eating pasta with no bread, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, a jazz record playing softly in the background. There were no candles or perfect settings, just mismatched plates, a flickering fireplace, and the quiet realization that being together made even ordinary things feel extraordinary. Eleanor glanced around the room while he poured her a second glass of sparkling apple cider. His cottage reflected him, minimal but warm, with subtle details that hinted at his thoughtfulness. A photo of his parents on the mantel, a stack of books beside his reading chair, and near the window, a delicate vase holding a single daisy, the first flower she'd ever given him. As the evening drifted on, their conversation turned gentle and unguarded. "Do you miss the city?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. Miles looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I think I miss who I was trying to be there, but not who I became." She nodded, understanding. "I used to think success meant noise, movement, big things. But after my grandmother passed, I realized I needed stillness to actually feel alive." We sat in that stillness together, neither needing to fill it with more words. It was a comfort that ran deeper than silence. It was peace. From that night on, their time together unfolded like a slow, cherished novel. No rush, no urgency, just steady pages turning toward something lasting. They spent Sundays exploring the hills outside Willow Creek, walking through fields of wildflowers and moss-covered trails. Eleanor would bring a basket of pastries and tea, and Miles would bring his sketch pad, sometimes drawing her without her noticing, her hair catching the wind, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Once, as they sat beneath a cedar tree, she leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "You make the world feel quiet in the best way." He kissed the top of her head, so softly it felt like a promise. On one particularly chilly evening, Miles showed up at Bloom and Grace with a wooden box in hand. "What's this?" she asked, eyes curious. He opened it to reveal a handcrafted flower press. Inside were pieces of dried lavender, petals from the bouquet she gave him the day they met, and a note etched into the lid that read, "Some things are too beautiful not to keep." Tears welled in her eyes. She looked up at him, overwhelmed. "I didn't know anyone saw me like this," she whispered. Miles brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "I've seen you since day one." That night, she invited him to stay for dinner in the back room above the shop. They cooked together well, Eleanor did most of the cooking while Miles tried not to burn anything. After dinner, they danced barefoot in the kitchen, swaying to an old Billie Holiday record. There were no declarations of love, but everything about that evening spoke louder than words. Their bond deepened with each passing day. Eleanor began to open up about her fears, the ache of losing her parents so young, how she still sometimes waited for the phone to ring with their voices. Miles shared his guilt about not being present with his father, how he wished he could have asked him more about life, about love. They learned each other's rhythms. She hummed when she was focused. He tapped his pen when deep in thought. She liked mornings. He preferred evenings. But somehow, they always met in the golden hour between. He helped her repaint the flower shop's front door one weekend, choosing a shade of blue she called Forget-Me-Not. She helped him plant the first flower beds around his cottage, tucking notes beneath the soil with little poems written on them, just for fun. Once, Eleanor caught him standing in her shop doorway, watching her work with such tender awe that she forgot how to breathe for a moment. What? She asked, flustered. He smiled. Just how do you make everything feel like home? She didn't have an answer, but her heart did. Then came the quiet morning when he reached for her hand without thinking, lacing his fingers through hers as they walked through the Willow Creek garden path. It was the kind of gesture that spoke of comfort, of belonging. Neither of them said, I love you, yet, but it pulsed in everything they did. In the way he memorized the names of her favorite flowers. In the way she kept a fresh cup of his coffee, waiting, even before he arrived. In the way they lingered in doorways, never quite ready to part. Eleanor found herself dreaming of tomorrows she had never dared imagine before. Not because she needed saving, but because with Miles, she felt safe enough to grow. And Miles, who had once seen life in grids and blueprints, now saw it in color and curve, in the way Eleanor laughed when she was surprised, and the way she looked at the world like it still held magic. They weren't just falling in love, they were becoming each other's home. The first time Miles invited Eleanor over for dinner, he burnt the garlic bread. She laughed so hard she nearly dropped her wine glass, and instead of being embarrassed, he joined her in laughter, his eyes crinkling in that way she loved, like joy had finally learned where to live. They ended up eating pasta with no bread, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, a jazz record playing softly in the background. There were no candles or perfect settings, just mismatched plates, a flickering fireplace, and the quiet realization that being together made even ordinary things feel extraordinary. Eleanor glanced around the room while he poured her a second glass of sparkling apple cider. His cottage reflected him, minimal but warm, with subtle details that hinted at his thoughtfulness. A photo of his parents on the mantel, a stack of books beside his reading chair, and near the window, a delicate vase holding a single daisy, the first flower she'd ever given him. As the evening drifted on, their conversation turned gentle and unguarded. Do you miss the city? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. Miles looked at her for a long moment before answering. I think I miss who I was trying to be there. But not who I became. She nodded, understanding. I used to think success meant noise, movement, big things. But after my grandmother passed, I realized I needed stillness to actually feel alive. They sat in that stillness together, neither needing to fill it with more words. It was a comfort that ran deeper than silence. It was pieced out from that night on. Their time together unfolded like a slow, cherished novel. No rush, no urgency, just steady pages turning toward something lasting. They spent Sundays exploring the hills outside Willow Creek, walking through fields of wildflowers and moss-covered trails. Eleanor would bring a basket of pastries and tea, and Miles would bring his sketch pad, sometimes drawing her without her noticing, her hair catching the wind, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Once, As they sat beneath a cedar tree, she leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "You make the world feel quiet in the best way." He kissed the top of her head, so softly it felt like a promise. On one particular chilly evening, Miles showed up at Bloom and Grace with a wooden box in hand. "What's this?" she asked, eyes curious. He opened it to reveal a handcrafted flower. Press. Inside were pieces of dried lavender, petals from the bouquet she gave him the day they met, and a note etched into the lid that read, "Some things are too beautiful not to keep." Tears welled in her eyes. She looked up at him, overwhelmed. "I didn't know anyone saw me like this," she whispered. Miles brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "I've seen you since day one." That night, she invited him to stay for dinner in the back room above the shop. They cooked together well. Eleanor did most of the cooking while Miles tried not to burn anything. After dinner, they danced barefoot in the kitchen, swaying to an old Billie Holiday record. There were no declarations of love, but everything about that evening spoke louder than words. Their bond deepened with each passing day. Eleanor began to open up about her fears, the ache of losing her parents so young, how she still sometimes waited for the phone to ring with their voices. Miles shared his guilt about not being present with his father, how he wished he could have asked him more about life, about love. They learned each other's rhythms. She hummed when she was focused. He tapped his pen when deep in thought. She liked mornings. He preferred evenings. But somehow they always met in the golden hour between. He helped her repaint the flower shop's front door one weekend, choosing a shade of blue she called Forget-Me-Not. She helped him plant the first flower beds around his cottage, tucking notes beneath the soil with little poems written on them, just for fun. Once, Eleanor caught him standing in her shop doorway, watching her work with such tender awe that she forgot how to breathe for a moment. "What?" she asked, flustered. He smiled. "Just how do you make everything feel like home?" She didn't have an answer, but her heart did. Then came the quiet morning when he reached for her hand without thinking, lacing his fingers through hers as they walked through the Willow Creek garden path. It was the kind of gesture that spoke of comfort, of belonging. Neither of them said, "I love you," but it pulsed in everything they did. In the way he memorized the names of her favorite flowers. In the way she kept a fresh cup of his coffee, waiting even before he arrived. In the way they lingered in doorways, never quite ready to part. Eleanor found herself dreaming of tomorrows she had never dared imagine before. Not because she needed saving, but because with Miles, she felt safe enough to grow. And Miles, who had once seen life in grids and blueprints, now saw it in color and curve, and the way Eleanor laughed when she was surprised, and the way she looked at the world like it still held magic. They weren't just falling in love. They were becoming each other's home. The first crack came with a phone call. Miles had just finished planning a new row of marigolds outside his cottage when his phone buzzed. He hesitated, recognizing the number Clark and Bennett architectural firm. He hadn't spoken to anyone from his old firm in months. Curiosity won out. "Bennett speaking." "Miles," came a familiar voice, his former colleague, Jen Harper. "I know you said you weren't ready, but the board is offering you the Morrison project. Lead designer. International partnership. It's everything you used to talk about." He stood frozen, the garden trowel slipping from his hand. The Morrison project was legendary, an opportunity architects dreamed about. It was also based in San Francisco. "We'll fly you out next week if you're interested," she added. "Just think about it." Miles mumbled something close to agreement and hung up. But the weight of the call clung to him, trailing behind like fog. That evening, he didn't stop by Bloom and Grace. Eleanor noticed that the next day she visited him, instead knocking gently before stepping inside his cottage. He was at his desk, the phone call clearly still haunting his thoughts. "Hey," she said softly, You didn't come by yesterday. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Got caught up in some old work stuff. She tilted her head, sensing more. You okay? He hesitated. They want me back. My old firm. It's a huge project. Is it something you want? She asked. I don't know, he replied honestly. It's everything I once worked for. But now there's here. There's you. Eleanor's breath caught. The words were tender, yet edged with uncertainty. Would it mean leaving Willow Creek? She asked, voice steady but quiet. He nodded. Eleanor sat down beside him, wrapping her arms around herself as if to keep something from slipping away. And what would you do? Go back to the life you left? I don't know, he repeated, more to himself than her. It feels like the version of me that wanted that job doesn't exist anymore. But part of me is afraid to let it go completely. She looked at him for a long time before standing. I understand, she said, though her chest ached. But I need to know if you're building something here, ... or just visiting. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and trembling. Past miles disappeared into his thoughts, into sketchbooks and silent walks. He didn't call. He didn't visit the shop. Eleanor tried to convince herself she didn't care, but every time the bell over the door rang, her heart betrayed her by hoping it was him. The town noticed too. Annie from the bakery gave her extra croissants. Mr. Winslow lingered longer on. Tuesdays. Even the sun seemed to dim. Eleanor stood behind her flower counter one morning, staring at the arrangement she couldn't finish. Lavender and lilacs, his favorites. She missed his voice, his questions, his way of looking at her like she mattered more than the world outside. She missed them, the feeling of being seen, of being chosen. But she also knew she couldn't be someone's second choice. Someone's soft landing while they reached for something else. Miles, meanwhile, wrestled with his decision. He drove to the city to meet with the firm, sat in their glass offices with views that once thrilled him, and felt nothing. The offer was generous, the prestige was undeniable, but everything about it felt hollow. He spent one night in his old apartment, surrounded by forgotten trophies and expensive suits. And he realized that somewhere along the way, his heart had changed its address. It no longer beat for skylines or accolades. It beat for a flower shop that smelled of jasmine. And for a woman who arranged petals like prayers, still the fear lingered. What if he gave it all up and failed? What if he wasn't enough for a life built on slower rhythms and softer truths? On the 5th night of his silence, Eleanor stood by the lake where they once watched the stars. She held one of his drawings, pressed flowers etched into glass panels, and let a single tear roll down her cheek. I don't need perfect, she whispered into the wind. I just needed you to choose us. She folded the drawing and tucked it into her pocket. The next morning, she opened her shop as usual, watering each bloom as if they were old friends. But inside, her heart was wilting. Until the bell above the door rang. And Miles stepped in. He looked different, tired. Yes, but certain. In his hands was a wooden box. The flower press. I never said goodbye, he said quietly. Eleanor stood. Frozen, he stepped closer. I went to the city, took the meetings, sat in the buildings I once thought were everything. She waited, and I realized none of it made sense without you. Her lips parted, her eyes wide. I was afraid, he continued. Afraid of choosing something smaller than what I'd always imagined. But then I remembered what you told me: balance and beauty both speak to the heart. And mine, it's never been louder than when I'm with you. He opened the wooden box. Inside was a new page, a fresh daisy press beside a new sketch. Garden, a home, a future. With her, the bell over the flower shop door stopped ringing. The only sound was the gentle hum of the refrigerator in the back and the shallow rise. and fall of Eleanor's breath as she stared at Miles. He was standing in front of her, holding the wooden flower press like it was the most sacred thing he'd ever built. And in his eyes, clear, unwavering, was everything she had once hoped to see: sincerity, love, and the courage to choose. "Brought this back," he said softly, stepping closer. "Because I'm not leaving." Her lips parted, but no words came out. "I spent so long chasing a version of success that looked good on paper. But you ... he exhaled slowly. "You made me feel alive, real, like I wasn't just existing anymore." Her eyes shimmered, voice a whisper. "Then why did you go?" "I needed to know if I was ready to let go of who I was before I could become the man who deserves you." Eleanor looked down, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "Do you think I waited here because I wanted someone perfect?" Miles moved closer. "No," he said gently. "But I needed to believe I could choose you ... with my whole heart. Not torn between cities and dreams, but here with you in this life." She looked up then, really looked, and saw the man she had grown to love flawed, tender, brave in a way he never used to be. A man who came back not because he was lost, but because he had found what truly mattered. "I was angry," she admitted, voice trembling. "Not because you left, but because I let myself hope. I let myself believe that maybe, just this once, I'd be enough for someone to stay." Miles stepped even closer, their breath almost shared. "You're more than enough. Eleanor, you are the reason I want to stay." He opened the flower press in his hands and sighed. The sketch he had drawn of her garden was now fully realized, inked carefully into a blueprint labeled Heart Garden Pavilion, Community Healing Space. "I want to build this," he said. "Not for a firm, not for a portfolio, but for Willow Creek, for you, for us." Her hand trembled as she reached for the edge of the blueprint. "You really want a life here?" "I want a life with you," he replied, and then, at last, the final wall between them fell. Eleanor stepped forward, wrapping her arms around his waist. He pulled her in tightly, burying his face into her shoulder as if she were the one safe place in the world. They didn't kiss. Not yet. Instead, they held each other, breathing, breaking, and healing all at once. "You scare me," she whispered against his chest. He pressed his lips to her hair. "You ground me." She looked up, her voice no longer trembling. "Then let's build something together, slowly, honestly, one bloom at a time." Miles smiled, eyes glistening. "I wouldn't want it any other way." Just outside the window, the wind stirred the wind chimes Eleanor had hung beside the door. The sound was soft, melodic, like something beginning. He took her hand in his, intertwining their fingers the way he had the night they walked by the lake. But this time, it wasn't a question. It was a vow. Spring melted into early summer, and Willow Creek bloomed in full. The days grew longer, and the rhythm of life carried with it a quiet hum of something, new something, hopeful. Eleanor stood in front of Bloom and Grace, gazing at the freshly painted sign above her shop. Below it, tucked into a wooden flower box, built with care and carved initials, soft blue forget-me-nots danced in the breeze. The town had noticed the changes, the way Miles now walked beside her in the mornings, coffee in one hand, her fingers laced in his. How he waved to the shopkeepers and asked about their lives like he was always meant to be part of this place. The way Eleanor laughed more now, freely, deeply, like a song returning after years of silence. Together, they had started work on the Heart Garden Pavilion. It began as an idea in a sketchbook, but it quickly became something real. With the help of the town and miles of wildflowers, it would become a place of peace where people could sit beneath wooden arches, surrounded by petals and quiet. It was where Miles had first envisioned a future, and now it was where he knelt before her. Weeks later, beneath a tree wrapped in string lights, holding a ring of silver with a tiny pressed daisy set under glass. Eleanor Hart, he said, his voice trembling with joy. You were never just a chapter in my story. You were the turning point. Will you marry me? Tears slipped down her cheeks as she nodded, laughing through the emotion. Only if we get married in the garden we built. He stood, slipping the ring on her finger, and kissed her forehead, her nose, and finally her lips soft and sure. Their first kiss wasn't dramatic, Dot. It was perfect, warm, slow, and filled with the kind of love that needed no fireworks, just the sound of their hearts catching up with the truth they'd always known. The wedding came months later, small, intimate, full of wildflowers and handmade decorations. Eleanor walked down the garden path barefoot, petals tucked into her braid. As the entire town gathered beneath the pavilion, Annie from the bakery cried the hardest. Mr. Winslow held a tulip in his lapel. Children chased butterflies through the tall grass, and someone played an old violin softly under the willow tree. Miles couldn't take his eyes off her, and when she reached him, he whispered, "You're my beginning and my home." They exchanged vows under the archway they built together, their hands dusted with soil, their hearts wrapped in everything they'd grown individually and together. Later that evening, they danced beneath a sky full of stars. Fairy lights twinkled above as Eleanor leaned into Miles, her cheek against his chest, his arms around her like shelter. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what would have happened if we'd never met?" He smiled, brushing his lips against her temple. "I don't, because I think I would have spent my whole life searching for the girl with flowers in her hair and forever in her eyes." She looked up at him then, eyes wide with love. "Forever?" He kissed her again, gently. "Forever." And so it was a life not filled with grand gestures, but with little ones that meant everything: morning tea and garden walks, whispered promises in the dark, a shared look across the shop on a busy day, a love that bloomed in the quiet, a love that stayed. Together, they didn't just find each other. They found home. They found peace. They found forever in her eyes.